2021. And let me just say that, these are some of the risks of working from home. This pandemic has really, really thrown us some curveballs. As you can hear, we have just struck the hour of the call to prayer. And so I will just request that we just do take this moment of silence and respect for our Muslim brothers and sisters and finish the call to prayer. Thank you so much for your patience. Well, in early October 2020, India and South Africa presented a proposal to the TRIPS Council requesting a temporary waiver of the implementation, application, and enforcement of the agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, now known well to all of us as the TRIPS waiver, in relation to the prevention, containment, and treatment of COVID-19. And in the draft decision notes, it was noted that the COVID-19, a global pandemic, requires a global response based on unity, solidarity, and multilateral cooperation. And in the light of these exceptional circumstances, waivers from the obligations of the agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights were justified. Now, it has since been reported that the TRIPS waiver has been granted, but the negotiations remain very difficult. And, whether it's a waiver or not a waiver, or a real waiver or not a real waiver, has really been the subject of discussion since this TRIPS waiver was proposed and since there have been some provisional approvals. Now, today, in this Women's Month, we are extremely fortunate to be joined by leaders in this conversation, all of them women in this panel. And it really is my honor and pleasure to welcome these esteemed ladies. And I would just quickly like to introduce the panel. And I'd like to start by introducing Ambassador Mlumbi Peters, who is the DDG, the Department of Trade and Industry. And she has served as South Africa's chief negotiator for Africa Multilateral Economic Relations, and currently takes up the role of DDG, as I said, in international trade and economic development. Welcome, Ambassador Mlumbi Peter, and we really look forward. We're going to start with you, and we look forward to hearing how this conversation began, this global and very important conversation began, and where we're at now in your opening remarks. We are also very fortunate to be joined by Dr. Michelle Mcmurray from AfricaBio, which is Biotechnology and Innovation Organization. And she is the president and CEO. She's a medical doctor and an immunologist, and she's had 12 years of research experience before tackling policy and leadership roles in government and industry. And the focus of her work has been broadening access to scientific progress to ensure more patients from diverse backgrounds can have access to cutting-edge technology. Welcome, Dr. Murray Heath. We really look forward to hearing what you have to say about the TRIPS waiver conversation. We are also joined all the way from Delhi by Ms. Anjali Nair. Welcome. And she's the Executive Vice President of Global Health Strategies. More than 20 years of experience in global health issues with expertise in developing integrated strategies to impact health policy. Welcome. Wonderful to have you. I did ask Ms. Nair if before we get really into the meat of things, I know that everybody in the audience wants to know what's happening in India. India was the epicenter of course, the Delta variant. which has swept across the globe and really showed us, that COVID-19 continues to have a changing face and a changing attitude. So we'd like to know where India is at right now, any lessons that have been learned, and then we'll come to the TRIPS waiver. And then we are joined as well by Ms. Nhlanhla, who is also from Global Health Strategy, but she's the Senior Director now for Africa. And she's an experienced director working in global health, human rights, media, and social justice fields, skilled in organizational development, leadership and management, strategic communication, policy advocacy, fundraising, and grant making. And she's also been training and facilitating, also been in journalism, media relations, and report writing. You sound a little bit like me, we want to do as much as possible. And so it sounds like we have a kindred spirit. We're going to have a great conversation. And ladies, welcome to all of you. Ambassador, let me start with you. Now, Ambassador, I just, I do, whenever I'm confronted with a difficult conversation, I like to start with the simple things. And I often find that when I ask simple questions, they become a bit provocative. Could you maybe start us off by just telling us what is the TRIPS waiver, and what is the definition of a waiver? And do you feel like this definition is something that those who are part of this conversation are agreeing on the definition, or does the waiver mean different things to different people? Ambassador?
Thank you very much, Dr. Manzi, for the question. And also let me start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to this important ladies' conversation. A TRIPS waiver is about suspending certain provisions of the TRIPS agreement in recognition of the fact that we have an unprecedented crisis of our times. And the Marrakesh Agreement establishing the WTO in terms of Article 9 does allow that in certain exceptional circumstances, the obligations of members and specific provisions can be waived or suspended temporarily so as to address those special circumstances. So when we proposed with India the TRIPS waiver, it was taking into account that we have exceptional circumstances that warrant that we look at the barriers that affect access and equitable access at that to life-saving drugs as well as technologies, so that we can deal in a timely manner with the pandemic. So that was really the purpose of the pandemic. But let me, I don't know whether you want me to also touch briefly on the opening remarks, including the rationale for the TRIPS waiver. I want to start off by saying that South Africa fully acknowledges the important role of intellectual property rights to research, innovation, and broadly the innovation architecture. And this is clearly visible in the balanced and progressive intellectual property policy that South Africa approved in 2015, as well as the TRIPS compliant IPR regime that we have in South Africa. We are currently busy with patent reform that will further strengthen our IP regime, and all of that is at an advanced stage. But having said this, as I said, we are dealing with an unprecedented crisis of our time. And we have already lost over 4 million people. And I think it was also appropriate that we start this, as we did, Dr. Manzi, with a prayer. And we also have an economic impact that arises from this pandemic, in that people are losing jobs and livelihoods. And African countries have been acutely impacted by this pandemic. A study by UNDP, for example, on the socio-economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has indicated, looking at 10 African countries, that the GDP has decreased by between minus 2.6 to 10.6%. Therefore, the statement by the World Bank, the IMF, as well as the WTO and the WHO, that vaccine policy is economic policy, rings through. The key challenge that we are all facing is that we have inadequate supply to meet demand. vaccine nationalism, the race to purchase vaccines by those who can afford them, including vaccine hoarding, in our view, is not a solution to deal with the current crisis that is facing us all. And in our view, these are pernicious examples of beggar thy neighbor policies that we need to address. The statistics show us that approximately 75% of the 3.9 billion doses that have been administered so far have gone to people in high income and upper middle income countries. And I think all of us can agree that this is unacceptable. Equitable access to vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics is therefore important. We are also aware that around 11 billion doses are required to fully vaccinate at least 70% of the population so that we get to immunity. We are also hearing that we'll be able to get to this figure by the end of 2021. But what is worrying and of concern to us is that what is forecasted to be produced by 2021 has already been sold, and mainly to rich countries, according to data from Affinity. This leaves little room for African countries to be able to access and buy the doses that they need for themselves. Therefore, vaccine production, including of inputs, is very important. But we are also aware that vaccine production, including of the inputs that are required, are highly concentrated among a few countries. And this has exposed the strategic vulnerability of especially Africa, that relies on imports of 99% of its vaccine needs. Therefore, prioritizing, as I said, vaccine production in Africa is an absolute necessity. And we must use all the policy tools that we have available so that we can achieve that objective. I must say that we also recognize the role that has been played by the private sector in producing, in a timely manner, the vaccines. And we welcome also the progress that has been made on voluntary mechanisms, including the launch of Vaccine mRNA Technology Hub in South Africa, as well as various partnerships between South African companies and IP holders towards the production of vaccines in South Africa. But we also feel that much more needs to be done to scale up production, especially if you want to deal with the deadly variants, as well as ensure that in a timely manner, we deal with the various waves that continue to emphasize the urgency of passing the TRIPS waiver so that we can ensure timely, affordable, and equitable access to life-saving medical products and technologies. We also hear that IP barriers are not the only barriers, and we agree with that. Our view is that addressing trade restrictions only, while these are important, is not sufficient, because countries, unfortunately, as we have seen with the COVID-19 pandemic, will engage in self-defeating vaccine nationalism as long as there is insufficient supply. So the priority for all of us should be to ensure that we boost and diversify production of vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics across the world so that we can deal with the pandemic in a timely manner. And we have also seen that some of the biggest proponents of free trade are implementing measures to prioritize their own populations and are engaging in vaccine diplomacy instead of ensuring, as initially pledged by everyone, that vaccines should be public goods. Therefore, to save lives, we must bring the pandemic to an end. It is global cooperation that resulted in efficient production of vaccines. And we've seen that global cooperation, whether through public funding or sharing of data or innovation by companies, assisting all of us to be able to produce these vaccines in a timely manner. Therefore, we need to ensure that, again, when it comes to access to life-saving technologies as well as medical products, that global solidarity informs what we are supposed to do. And this means that we should be prepared to share the technologies so that we can end the pandemic. As stated by the United States Trade Representative, extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. Therefore, the TRIPS waiver is a necessary as well as targeted, time-limited, and proportionate legal measure that is aimed at addressing the barriers that are related to intellectual property so that we can boost and diversify production across the world. And it is a way of ensuring that we have a direct and transparent and efficient mechanism to achieve that objective. I must also emphasize that the waiver is consistent with the WTO legal framework. And it's not the first time that a waiver would be approved. The WTO approves waivers as long as I said, there is an exceptional circumstance. And even in the context of the TRIPS agreement, waivers have been approved before. So this is not, as I say, the first time that we will be taking this decision. Therefore, passing the waiver will allow companies the freedom to operate and to produce the covered COVID-19 health products. And I must also emphasize that we're not talking about waiving IP rights for any other disease or pandemic. We're only talking about waiving IP rights in relation only to COVID-19 related health products and technologies. Therefore, in the context of the current pandemic, it is vital that we take every action to ensure that we're able to leverage existing manufacturing capacity that exists, especially in developing countries, so that we can deal with the pandemic in a more effective way. Lastly, Chair, as I conclude, the waiver is widely supported, both within and outside the WTO, by Nobel Peace Laureates, by former presidents, by civil society in general. And we believe that it is important that we continue the discussions in the WTO so that we can look at approving a balanced waiver that achieves two things: response to the health crisis, and assist us, of course, to diversify and boost production across the world. But also it must continue to incentivize research and innovation. And in the revision to the TRIPS waiver that we submitted in June, we did indicate and emphasize the importance of ensuring that we need a balanced outcome that will also incentivize research and innovation. And we are therefore hopeful that, that those who are yet to support the waiver will do so, because there is emerging consensus that this is a necessary measure that we must all implement. I thank you, Chair.
I would now like to take us across the seas, and we will ask Ms. Naya to weigh in. Ms. Naya, South Africa and India went in on this proposal together, and I would firstly like for you to just talk to us a little bit about, just give us this broader context of the pandemic and talk to us a little bit about what has been happening in India in terms of the epidemiology itself. And in your opening remarks, I know you have your opening remarks, but if you could just really touch on this relationship we share during the ministry. I really came to appreciate deep historic relationship that we share with India in many, many aspects, but in the biotech sphere, we certainly have a very, very unique relationship. I think it would be beneficial for the audience to kind of understand this relationship and understand how it is that we even came to partner on this very progressive proposition to the World Trade Organization. Ms. Naya?
Thank you so much. First of all, I'd really like to thank Dr. Msomi for inviting me, and really, really honored to be on this panel. And so thank you very much, Chair, for asking me. You're right in the sense that South Africa and India have a very special relationship, and that goes back many, many years, particularly when we look at the father of our nation, Mahatma Gandhi, who studied there and then moved back. And I remember when I was at the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, and I went to meet the foreign minister, the Indian foreign minister, telling him about IAVI and the work that we do. The moment he heard that one of the programs that I was looking at was South Africa, he said, whatever you want, you're working in my favorite country. And if I weren't living in India, I would be there. And he had participated in the apartheid movement in the early years. And so that's the kind of close relationship that we have. And we've seen that through India, Brazil, South Africa. We've seen that through Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. In fact, when BRICS started, it was really BRIC without the S, and it was India that insisted that South Africa need to be brought in. So I can quite understand that India and South Africa drove the campaign to temporarily waive IP protection on coronavirus vaccines and reached out to several countries. So finally, it was backed by 100 countries and the heads of WHO and UNAIDS, leading to the Biden administration also to support it. So you're absolutely right. Regarding India, we went through, as you know, as everyone knows, a horrific second wave. And I remember during those months where we were constantly awake, listening to cries for oxygen, beds, and the most influential could not get a bed. And I think no one in India wants ever to be in a situation like that. Today, I think we are better prepared. I know that we are planning for a third wave, knowing that the Delta variant, we're a big country. We know that the Delta variant has moved into rural areas, and the epidemic is really going to be in small pockets and maybe as intense and as devastating. I mean, the third wave may be as intense and as devastating, but we seem to be prepared for it. And I think, Ambassador Peter, what you said made such a lot of sense. And to me, one of the things the pandemic has really shown is, again, it's highlighted the issues related to access and equity. And these are the core problems of the COVID pandemic: access to diagnostics, vaccines, and drugs. And when the Biden administration also supported IP, and when India and South Africa led the campaign, there were several who argued that really the obstacles to access and availability include regulatory bottlenecks, supply chain, transport, storage, cold chain facilities, trained staff, data tracking, and vaccine hesitancy. So it's not just the IP issues alone. And as you said rightly, yes, absolutely. But that's where we start off. Because traditionally, if you look at patents, they've always worked towards, that it's diffuse, you invest today and you diffuse the invention over the long term. Whereas with the pandemic, we need the diffusion today. We need the technologies today. We need the even the knowledge and the know-how today. So today we need to accelerate the diffusion. And we also recognize, as you said, that the COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics are complex. They're not something that you can, start today. So today, because we've had these vaccines so quickly, a lot of people argue whether they're safe or not. But what we forget is that the mRNA technology, for instance, is something that scientists invested years ago, and companies invested their money years ago and made these risky investments, not just in research, but also in commercial startups. And that's why, because we have the technology, therefore we could get these vaccines. So today, we want to have partnerships. We want to make sure that these technologies, these know-how are available to everyone. One of the things that we know that the WTO recommends is compulsory licensing. And that's really to override IP during emergencies to support and enable access of medicines in the short term. I know that India has done that for cancer drugs, and there was a big case with Novartis, which was published all over the world to enable access. Bolivia is looking to apply compulsory licensing for manufacturing J&J vaccines. But compulsory licensing will only help if there is manufacturing capacity for the near term, because as I mentioned, this is a very complex process. And even if you go for compulsory licensing, legally, it can be a very time-consuming process. So what we need to do today is, if we are focusing on IP, if we have, yes, absolutely. I'm going to finish right now. That if we focus, if we want to make sure the IP waiver is there, and it's absolutely right for, for the pandemic today, we also simultaneously need to start working on a positive ecosystem for R&D by governments, including tax credits, recognition awards for inventions, and direct funding for medical innovations. We want to incentivize local private industries for effective therapies and vaccines, advance commitments for predetermined quantities, because these companies will only invest if they know that there is a buyer for their products. And to me, a big opportunity lies ahead is South-South collaboration to supplant the current situation where only a small group of companies, including in India and countries, hold the monopoly on manufacturing and the much needed technologies. And we've seen we've seen ASEAN doing very well when they look at common minimum standards. We've seen BRICS health ministers that have done a huge amount of work for tuberculosis. We've also, across the continent, we've got African Union, we've got SADC, we've got ASA. These are platforms that need to be strengthened to enable this transfer of technologies. I don't think manufacturing agreements is the only way possible. I think transfer of technology and investment so that each country develops vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. This is probably not, the pandemic is by no means over, and it's probably not going to be the last outbreak that we see. So thank you so much again for inviting me.
Thank you very, very much. Let's move on and let's come back to our shores, and I will ask Ms. Nhlanhla to weigh in. But because we are we're only going to have now half an hour left, I'd like to ask two questions based on the previous conversations, just to keep moving our conversation along. With your opening address, I just want to check two things with you, Ms. Nhlanhla, since you wear so many hats. The ambassador said the ambassador pointed out a lot of the socio-economic and humanitarian arguments for the TRIPS waiver, which are absolutely important and which are absolutely critical. But we all know that investors, they just want to know if the money that they invested, if they're going to get it back plus interest, how do you push when you're engaging these discussions? How do you push really? And I think that, of course, Ms. Naya has alluded to some of this incentivization, but I really would like to know how you push that conversation to appeal to investors. Of course, many of the investors are actually countries, but the ones who are making the biggest noise are the private investors. So I'd really like to know what the rebuttal is when you really engage that conversation. And then the second question that I'd like to probe on is that suppose tomorrow we get the outcome we want. As Africa, are we ready to be able to actually manufacture at the scale that is required to take full advantage of the TRIPS waiver? And if we're not, what are the things that we need to engage in? And I think, let me not just, I think I would also like Dr. Mcmurray here to also weigh in on these two questions when she comes with the opening remarks. So I've posed the questions now. You can go ahead with your opening remarks and Dr. Heath can come straight in. But I'd really like, these are two questions that often we get posed with, and I'd really like us to just nail it now and provide clarity in that regard. Thank you very much. You can go ahead, Ms. Nhlanhla.
Well, thank you very much. Hope my mic is on. Yes, thank you very much for that. So you're right, I wear many hats, and one of them is that I do come from a civil society activism background here in South Africa. And the waiver, as you know, has been supported by civil society. But we do face real challenges in the African continent. And we know, for instance, that, the countries that we can say are ready for manufacturing, Egypt, Senegal, and South Africa as examples, we have limited manufacturing capacity. But then there are other issues, of course, that go alongside this waiver. is that, you know, in the TRIPS discourse, we know that when flexibilities are being used by countries, there are usually problems that African countries encounter in that space. Some of them include, you know, lack of technical expertise or infrastructure and resources to implement complex systems like examinations of patents and processing of compulsory license applications. For example, a study done by MSF showed that in 2008 alone, South Africa had granted 2,442 patents on medicines, and compared to Brazil, between 2003 and 2008, Brazil had only granted 273 patents on medicine. And this was happening because South Africa was doing this without an extensive examination system. Then the second issue, of course, is around, you know, the pressure and the bullying tactics that high-income countries use to make sure that, you know, low-income countries or middle-income countries do not use the flexibilities. And even when countries have provisions for compulsory licensing, I mean, they are also very difficult to implement. They face repercussions if they do use them. And an example Anjali was speaking about India is that when India issued its first compulsory license on pharmaceutical patents, the US applied continuous pressure on India to discourage any further compulsory licensing on patented medicine. So these are some of the challenges that you know, South countries find themselves in, and make collaboration at times a bit tricky. Then the other issues is that, you know, the waiver, yes, can be granted, but what we need, in fact, is a long-term solution. Long-term solutions that address issues of inequality between developed and developing countries, but also within countries, you know, in terms of access to health services and medicines. So the other challenge that is faced is that even, you know, yes, the waiver gets granted, some countries will still have to domesticate the provision of the waiver into national laws through their legal processes, and that may take time, and it is the time that we currently actually do not have. I mean, another challenge is that, you know, even though the waiver can be granted, you know, there is very little compulsion on IPR holding corporations to cooperate. So what, you know, is needed there is for high income countries, you know, which house the majority of relevant IPR, to add measures that will enable full disclosure and commit to transparency, transfer of technology, and manufacturing know-how. So there is greater advocacy that is required, not just from civil society, but from our own governments. And this appears to be a journey that is not just about now. As I mean, when we speak about pandemics, here is one pandemic that is really throwing us off, but we also know that it is possible that we may face another pandemic of a different kind. Therefore, what are the long-term solutions that we are looking for that will address these issues? So in my view, there is really a need for greater political will, you know, for our governments to actually challenge the powerful political and economic powers, to lift monopolies and give governments and manufacturers the freedom to operate and collaborate for the development and production of medical products beyond what we are experiencing right now. And governments need to build the technical expertise, infrastructure, and resources to manufacture, but also to implement the complex systems that allow for the TRIPS flexibilities to be used. And just in conclusion, I mean, we know that there is really, you know, a greater responsibility that governments need to do more. But also when we speak about innovation, usually when we speak about innovation, we speak about it in economic terms. But what we actually would want to see is when we speak about innovation in a way where people can actually benefit from the fruits of the innovation that is taking place. So right now, when we see that monopolies corporates that are monopolies, they seem to have the greater benefit of this system. But when we look at how is innovation, what's driving innovation, it's R&D, which is mainly funded by governments, and people contribute to this knowledge in many ways. I mean, under COVID-19, we've seen healthcare workers, patients, COVID-19 survivors, and the general public, contributing to clinical trials and other R&D activities. So there is actually, a greater responsibility to ensure that access to this knowledge is actually democratized and it is made accessible and does not become the main beneficiary, becomes the monopolies and not so much the people who are actually investing in this through their through taxes and through their lives. And so these are some of the issues. A number of civil society organizations here in South Africa and all over the world have been advocating for health to be put before profits. And this is the big call they are making around this, that it is not just about enabling manufacturing, but enable human beings, ordinary people on the ground, particularly the most vulnerable, to access a better health anywhere in the world as it is required. And so, I mean, we are hoping that this waiver, while it is a very good step, it would be interesting to see what actually does it bring us in terms of what can be pushed forward in the future to ensure that public health and improving people's health becomes the center of the conversation rather than commercial interest and economic development.
Thank you so much. Very, very powerful words there. And Dr. Mcmurray Heath, actually, I just want to pick up on on what our colleague has said here and ask you as well in your comments. Yes, indeed. In fact, the investors are ordinary citizens because much of the R&D is funded through government. So the question is, how can ordinary citizens also be part of the activism that is driving this proposition to the WTO?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's so wonderful to be part of this global panel of powerful women. What a great conversation. My name is Dr. Michelle Mcmurray Heath. I'm the president and CEO of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, or BIO. We are the world's largest biotech advocacy organization with more than 1,000 members in over 30 countries. We represent big companies, but also hundreds of small and emerging companies, as well as universities and research institutions as well. Many of our companies have no revenue or products on the market, but they are taking those huge scientific risks, trying to hope to discover the next big breakthrough that can help improve human life around the globe. And a number of our companies are run by scientist entrepreneurs who take these ideas from the lab and experiments into years of research. One of the panelists referenced that mRNA technology really has its roots in decades of scientists investing in trying to uncover how this technology could be helpful for improving lives. But no matter where we come from or where we work, all of us here agree that equity in access to COVID vaccines and treatments is an urgent global priority. We all agree on that. And time is of the essence. So this priority means that we have to quickly improve global production, distribution, and administration of COVID vaccines. And I'm also a former US Food and Drug Administration regulator. And I will tell you, setting up from scratch vaccine manufacturing capacity is not something that happens overnight. Even if waivers were granted and we started to build this manufacturing capacity tomorrow, we are talking about 18 to 24 months before those new manufacturing sites would be able to deliver COVID vaccines. We do not have 18 to 24 months. As we've seen with the emergence of the Delta virus, in a country like India, where actually you saw the most licensing agreements of any place outside of the US and Europe, a country that was poised to really lead the global production of COVID vaccine manufacturing, even there, even where you had technology transfer, IP licensing, and manufacturing set up that was experienced and able to take on the manufacturing of these very complex vaccines, the global shortage of the raw materials and the difficulty and complexity of manufacturing these unique and new vaccines meant that those vaccines were not at the ready as that country faced its huge and heartbreaking second wave. So we have to dig beneath the platitudes and the slogans to what is really going to stop the tide of this pandemic. Everything has to happen as quickly as possible if we are going to save lives and stop the emergence of even more variants. So we have to figure out what is going to actually solve that issue. As we look, our companies are poised to produce 12 billion doses of the vaccine by year's end. This is in a global situation where we normally produce 2 to 3 billion vaccines globally in a year. So we are stretched at the seams trying to produce this huge tide of vaccines. And that means what's standing in our way is not necessarily IP waivers. It's really the ability to get the raw input materials and the coordination needed to produce those vaccines. And then, yes, once we have that supply that's so critical, we must do everything we can to knock down the barriers that stand in the way of everyone receiving these doses. And we at Bio have gone very far in talking about how important this is. And we've called upon the Biden administration to do things like ease their implementation of the Defense Production Act, to not fall prey to vaccine hoarding. Wealthy countries really must do everything they can to make sure that supply gets out to every corner of the globe. It's in everyone's interest that we do so. So as the virus continues to plague South Africa, the continent, and the world, the decisions we make in the weeks will have tremendous impact on people's lives. And we really believe the best way to improve global vaccine equity is to continue forging and deepening public and private partnerships. To date, we have almost 300 public-private partnerships between vaccine manufacturers and companies around the world to produce COVID vaccines. And there have been nearly 1,000 COVID vaccines, therapeutic, and diagnostic research and development programs launched to this day. And while some of the panelists referenced that there have been public investment in some of these COVID and vaccine and therapeutic research programs, many of them have been funded almost entirely by the private sector, often in years before there was any interest in this field. If we are going to keep that momentum, keep that interest, keep that speed of innovation going, then we need to protect the intellectual property carrot that fuels that engine. We like to talk about biotech innovation as if it's something that just happens. It just happens on its own. It's fruit we pick up from the ground, but it's actually a very tenuous and delicate ecosystem that must be fostered and grown so that not just for this pandemic, but for the next pandemic to come, we have the breakthroughs we need to treat each and every patient. And we must and have to do everything we can to treat every patient in need.
Well, thank you so much for those inputs. Now, let me just check with admin if there are any questions, any hands up. I'm not really seeing the audience view, so we'll have to just first check with. I'd like to just check with admin if there are if there's anybody who'd like to ask a question. No questions. Okay. Well, I have a question. I have a couple of questions. So let me stay with you, Doctor. I asked you a question. I haven't heard the answer. I was asking, how can ordinary people be part or play activist roles in the push for the TRIPS waiver?
Well, as a physician, I think we have to be advocates for what is going to save most human health as quickly as possible. And unfortunately, I don't think that the TRIPS waiver is the most efficient or effective way to go after saving human lives. if we really want to save lives from this COVID vaccine, and if we want people to become activists on that front, they need to be pushing their governments and pushing wealthy nations to make sure that they are promoting the development of public health infrastructure so that when vaccines on the ground, it can be distributed. We need to be talking about how we now and in the future internationalize vaccine manufacturing capacity so that we have the capacity and the facilities online and regulatorily approved in every corner of the globe. They should not be just in a few areas, they should be in many. I think it's a promising sign that South Africa is starting an mRNA vaccine technology hub so that companies can voluntarily participate in those hubs and share their learnings and their expertise and make sure we're fostering that capacity in every corner. But we do have to become activists. We do have to become interested, because science doesn't just happen and it doesn't just get out to everyone who needs it on its own. It takes committed activists like those in this conversation, but also in many corners of the globe, to keep being vocal about what's needed to share the technology and get it to everyone in need.
Thank you so much. Ambassador, I'd like to come back to you because the good doctor made some slightly provocative comments in her opening remarks, and it made me wonder, suppose a South African or an African innovator comes to you and says, well, you know what, I'm a little bit worried here. What if I have a breakthrough API and all of a sudden there's this TRIPS waiver and I'm going to lose out now because my IP can just be shared with anybody? What do you have to say to innovators who were hoping that they were going to develop an intellectual property and really do well with it, and now they're kind of going to have to share it? How do you continue incentivizing innovation in a region that has historically been on the back foot of so-called the IP continuum? Ambassador?
Well, as I said, the TRIPS waiver will be targeted and time limited just for us to be able to produce and diversify production, because I think everyone agrees that we need sharing of technology and know-how to be able to produce as quickly as we can. But immediately after the waiver passes, we go back to the original regime, which means the IP rights will be protected. So it does not mean that we are just opening up the IP regime and there will no longer be protection of IP, because as I said, we do recognize the need to incentivize research and innovation. And I also want to emphasize that factually, it's only a few companies that will be able to take advantage of the TRIPS waiver. We do understand that producing vaccines, producing medicines is a complex process, and it requires, as everyone said, an ecosystem. You need to ensure that you produce quality products. So the regulatory authorities are quite critical to ensure that at the end of the day, whatever is produced under the waiver will be a quality product. So you do need to have that ecosystem. You do need investment. You do need sharing of skills and technologies to be able to produce. However, what is clear is that relying only on the private sector and voluntary mechanisms to promote that sharing of technology is not working, because if it was, we would have unlocked production. The WTO and the DG of the WTO convened 2 engagements with the private sector to understand where are we with production, to understand what the barriers are with production. And we had manufacturers, especially those in developing countries, that are saying, yes, I'm contracted to now produce X amount of vaccines, but I have capacity and capability to produce 1 billion. But I cannot produce that 1 billion because what I'm contracted to do means that I must only confine myself to this X amount of products. When we need vaccines, when we have countries that are struggling to access vaccines, which is why we are saying there are cases where IP has proven to be a barrier. Because if that technology was shared widely with those companies that have capacity and capability to produce, we would not be sitting where we are. And the TRIPS agreement also calls for a balance. the objectives of the TRIPS agreement are very clear, that we must protect IP for the producers of IP, but also protect IP for the users of IP. And I think if there was a case where we need to ensure that we protect IP for everyone, it is the case of COVID-19, because this is one pandemic or one virus that does not know any boundaries. So even if you have countries that have managed to fully vaccinate their populations, no one is safe until everyone is safe. So the sharing of technologies, the sharing of data, and the sharing, as Ms. Mlangeni has rightly indicated, you have also patients that participated in vaccine trials because they wanted to ensure that all of us collaborate to be able to produce. So as I said, the TRIPS waiver is really time limited. It does not mean that we are undermining IP protection. It is something that is already provided for in the WTO framework, because even those who were negotiating the TRIPS agreement understood that there will be exceptional circumstances that warrant that certain provisions, that we're not also talking about opening up all the provisions of the TRIPS agreement. It's specific provisions of the TRIPS agreement that are necessary to ensure that we'll be able to share the technology and the know-how to be able to enable those who are able to produce. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Ms. Naya, I'm coming to you. The good ambassador has put together a very cogent argument. Be that as it may, we are still getting serious pushback from the EU and some of your colleagues in the East, the likes of Japan. What is the way forward, and how are you going to really get them to turn around? What's it going to take? What are you going to say to get them to turn around and come on board in this progression?
Thank you. So I think, a direct response to your question is really for countries to get together and put pressure at global forums. What has happened today is the vaccine nationalism. And even if you take a look at what happened in India, India did have the capacity to produce vaccines, but the government did not order enough. So when the Indian citizens couldn't get enough vaccines because there weren't enough orders placed at the right time, the government banned exports. Now, that's the worst form of vaccine nationalism, really, so to speak. So I think here is where countries have to come together. And as you said, no one is safe until everyone is safe. And yes, the EU and other countries in the East will put pressure. But I think when countries like India, South Africa, Brazil, and other strong middle income or powerful economies come together, I think we can make a difference, which is why, to me, the existing platforms are really important. How can we push G20? How can we use G20? How can we use the platforms across Africa? How can we use BRICS? How can we use ASEAN, for that matter? Very few countries, a lot of countries in Southeast Asia have a problem of access to vaccines. It's not just, and Japan is not the only one that covers the Asia-Pacific region. So I think it's these platforms really need to be activated, and citizens can do it. So it's really starting from citizens to political leaders to platforms reaching at the global level.
I really, really like that. Now, unfortunately, we only have 3 minutes left, so I will give those last minutes to Ms. Mlangeni. Ms. Mlangeni, your parting shot, and what do you have to say to African innovators as well in regards to the larger context of this discussion?
Well, innovation that is driven by commercial interests and if it is driven by commercial interests only, and it is not about ensuring that people can access and enjoy the benefits of that innovation, I think it's something that is questionable. I would imagine that innovators do want to see a wider use of their innovations, And while protection perhaps is acceptable to a certain level, it becomes problematic when most of the population is unable to access health products just because we are serving the interests of the innovators and not necessarily the interests of the population. So I think that a balance needs to be created there. I just also want to add as a parting shot that while you have a lot of activism by civil society organizations on this issue, one of the things that is really lacking is to help ordinary people understand these kind of issues. So there is a greater need, in fact, to educate people about how these issues actually impact directly on their lives, so that when you drive activism, you drive it not only as a national NGO of professionals, but you have the backing of the people from below, especially when they are participating in things like clinical trials, where they are used in an experiential way. Then people need to understand what they are participating in, what it will, how this will benefit them in the future. And so there is a greater need for more education around these issues, better communication around these issues, including when civil society goes and advocates for patent reforms, to just let the people know what does this mean in terms of their daily existence.
Well, thank you so much for that powerful parting shot. And unfortunately, this has been a most stimulating conversation that we unfortunately do have to end. Thank you so much, ladies, for coming through and for really, really pushing this conversation. I wish you all the best as you engage this very, very difficult negotiation. But we all know that at the end of the day, it's really to ensure the full protection of everybody around the world so that we can get past this pandemic and reclaim our lives. A huge thank you to BioAfrica for convening this conference and for convening this discussion and for inviting us to be part of this discussion. And a very happy Women's Month to all the beautiful ladies out there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Goodbye to everybody.
Thank you.
Ladies, I think we are